So, Tamiko, you wrote, how can we reclaim play and wonder as an anti-racist, anti-capitalist acts? How can we engage in play and wonder and delight for their own sake, while also working towards serious radical change? Yes, how? Can we dive into that question? I mean, it excites me so much to read that and to read your Substack newsletter. I mean, I just went through and read it all after I discovered your work.
Oh, thanks.
And I'm like, I get chills, but I'm also like, really? Because that feels like I'm suddenly not going to be serious about my activism.
Right, right. I mean, I feel like, oh, there's like so much, but to talk about play, I mean, play is really, I was thinking about this over the weekend. It's really like a practice for living, right? It's spring right now, and I live in a very urban area, but there's also like all these little baby ducks and baby rabbits and all sorts of puppies, and they're playing, they're practicing how to be in the world. And so I think about play as kind of a place where you can, or we can, experiment and let our imaginations really run wild. And the stakes are pretty low when you're playing, but that doesn't, yeah, it doesn't mean that there's not seriousness that can then arise from what you learn in play. And also, after I wrote that essay that you were referring to, the poet Duriel Harris, who spent a lot of time thinking about joy, and specifically Black joy and joy by people of color as a form of resistance. She wrote to me to say that she's been thinking lately that play is actually more dangerous to hegemony than joy. And we're going to talk about it more soon. We haven't had a chance to connect about it. But since she wrote to me about that, I've been thinking about how play really is a form of subversion, right? Like the fool or the jester in the king's court can say things that no one else can say. And play can also make fools of those in power. I'm thinking specifically about the yes men. I don't know if you know who they are.
No.
They're I don't know if they're doing things anymore, but in the early 2000s, they were just two guys, and they played pranks. So I think actually most recently, a few years ago, they put up a web page. I could be getting the details wrong, but they basically make statements pretending to be corporations. For example, saying like, I actually don't think they did this with Exxon, but I think they did it with a similar corporation, being like, yes, we admit our role in climate change. We're going to pay billions of dollars as reparations, that kind of thing. And they make it look really real, and
the logo and the right colors. And
yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. You know, when you were talking about play is even more subversive than joy. I mean, I can feel that even in my own day-to-day, I was having that sort of, oh my God, I'm so behind. There's so much I have to do. And then I paused and I'm like, whose voice is that? Whose voice is saying that you have to get this work done? Just beginning, I think play gets us to question things.
Right. And then like, I
went and played with my puppy then.
Right. Right. And that voice really, I think, is like capitalism, right? Which is like, you have to produce, you have to be working, you have to produce so that you can consume. And when you play, you're not, it's like reclaiming play is like a resistance to that, and a resistance to like the commodification of everything we do. Like you can't really, I mean, people try, but if you're really reclaiming play, you can't really put a price tag on it, right? You're not doing things to create something so that somebody can buy it.
There's nothing left afterwards. There's nothing to show for it.
Right.
I just made quote marks in the air, everybody. The other thing that comes up for me is that I have this side project I told you about, Create Plus Climate, and I try to get people to think of creative ways to respond to the climate crisis. And part of that is based on this idea of stubborn optimism, that we have to overcome both the media's tendency, but also our brain's tendency to give up because everything is screwed. And it seems like play could help with that. I'm not sure how, but to feed that stubborn optimism in a way, because when you were talking, it was making me feel optimistic. And can I marry that with my stubbornness to keep taking action?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to a different podcast. It's called 70 over 70, where they interview 70 people over the year, 70
the age
years
of
old.
70.
Yeah. And one of their guests was talking about basically the difference between hope and optimism, and how, and when, as she was talking about that, I was, I've heard this phrase, hope is a verb, which without really like understanding, I hadn't really thought much about it. But in that moment, I was like, oh, actually, like literally as a grammatical phrase, hope is a verb and optimism is an adjective or a noun, right? Hope means that you have to actually be engaging and doing it and practicing it. And so I think like there is, and that's the same with play, right? You have to actually engage in play and practice.
Can't think about it.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to go play.
And so I wonder if there's something there, in terms of, I think you're right. Like, I think the media, and I think the media parroting, what the powers of be want to communicate, which is that like, there is no hope. We might as well just consume until the end of the world. It really can weigh us down in terms of thinking about all, the climate crisis, white supremacy, like how do we change anything?
Violence against Asians.
And Black folk, so to like break out of that, I think like leaning into play, leaning into joy, leaning into magic, I think it really is, it's a way to expand our imaginations really, and to be like, oh, actually, no, this isn't how it has to be. This is how it is right now. And those who benefit from it and profit from it would like us to believe that we can't actually change anything, but we can. And engaging in the practice of play, I think really helps us start to see like different ways of being and different ways of relating and different ways of, having an economy.
That's brilliant. That makes my heart expand and makes me want to get up and dance.
I love that.
Yeah. So I know there's truth there. My body always says, yeah, there's truth there. Let's pivot to your work as a poet. You do a lot of different kinds of work as a writer, but and then the new book, Last Days, which I'll hold up here for people on the video to see. And I'd love for you to read a poem or two from it in a bit.
Yeah.
What role does play in your work?
Yeah, well, I think that I think one of the first and best books about writing that I read, that's a funny sentence that I just said.
we'll just have a few funny sentences in a row. Yeah.
But Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg was so influential to me when I was in high school and first starting to think like, oh, writing is something that maybe I could do. And, she really encourages people to just write without stopping, to just go where your imagination takes you. And I think that was just so influential for me in thinking about writing as a process and as just like the initial act of just not controlling it, not having an agenda, just kind of letting it all flow. And so in that way, I feel like it is play when I sit down at my notebook or on the computer screen. Sometimes I have an idea of what I want to write, especially if it's an essay. Often for poems, I don't. And I just play, especially with poetry, play with sounds, the sounds of language, the images that come up, the associations, and just see where it takes me. And then of course the editing process is where like that control and shaping and polish comes from. But the initial drafts, when on a good day, it really is.
It is play.
Yeah.
Is there a moment when an image or a sound or an idea comes to you and you say, oh, go towards essay, oh, go towards fiction, oh, go towards poetry? Like, is it instinctual? Is it more thought out? I'm always fascinated by those moments, those early moments of creation. What form is it going to take?
Yeah, for me, generally, I know what form it's going to take when I sit down to write, because I think, well, with essays, it's a relatively new form for me. And I've really just been writing them for my newsletter. And, I have to put one out at least once a month. I've been trying for twice a month. So I have a very regulated schedule that I'm very much about structure.
Mm-hmm.
So I
am too. Okay. I'm a huge believer in structure. I think the idea of the muse is so overblown. I always like all the different quotes of the muse will show up on Wednesday if you're showing up, or whatever those versions of people saying that is.
Yeah. I found that that's really been true for me in my creative life. But so I generally sit down to be okay, now I have to write my essay. And then for poetry, I often, my poems start when I write with others. So other poets, right now there's this Monday night gathering of BIPOC poets. And it started, Serena Lynn and Faith Adiele started this gathering when the pandemic started, and it's just been going ever since, with some different hosts. But it's 2 prompts every night. You write and you share, and that's really been for the last year and a half really where I start my poems. So it's in community, it's with prompts. And then I guess there are times where the ideas that come out in my poems get worked into my essays. And I imagine the reverse will be true as well, but or is true as well. But it's not conscious. Okay, I'm writing this poem, and now I'm going to go and take this idea and work it into an essay. It's really much more subconscious.
Yeah. So speaking of last days, would you read one of my favorite poems, which sounds like I haven't read the book, but I have because it's right at the beginning. Tankas for What Comes Together.
Yeah.
I love this poem. And then if you want to read one that you particularly love.
Tankas for What Comes Together. At dawn, the great blue heron curves, the river preens, stills as we approach. In the narrative of our walk, what comes together is a feeling. We are the people, the dogs, the birds. We emerge from sleep singular, then find each other. And that is the best way of waking. Do you want me to read another?
Please.
Okay. This one is Equinox. It's the second Equinox poem of the book. Equinox. Dear child of the near future, here is what I know. Hawks soar on the updraft, and sparrows always return to the seed source until they spot the circling hawk. Then they disappear for days and return, a full flock ready. I think we all have the power to do what we must to survive. One day, I hope to set a table, invite you to draw up a chair, greens, steaming garlic, slices of bread still warm, honey flecked with wax, and a pitcher of clear water. Sustenance for acts of survival, for incantations stirring across our tongues. Can we climb out of this greedy mouth, disappear, and then return in force? My stars are tucked in my pocket, ready for battle. If we flood the streets with salt water, we can flood the sky with wings.
That's so great. That's my other favorite poem in the book.
Oh, good.
What was it like to choose the flow of the book or the structure of the book? Not the individual poem structures, but the whole. Because I imagine there's that's a process in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was a process. So basically the poems in this book span almost a decade.
Wow.
My first book came out in 2013, and then I had a I got a full-time, very intense job right as actually I was sending my first manuscript out. And so basically for a period of 7 or so years, I would write poems, but I didn't have a chance to edit them or really do anything with them. And then in 2018, I left that job and I basically looked at all of these poems I had written over the span of those years, and just kind of started pulling out themes and threads and sequences. I had written, the central sequence of the book that's also called Last Days. I knew that was going to be like an organizing principle of the book, but I wasn't sure what else would go around it, or even like whether to have each section, each part of that Last Days poem separated throughout the book or have it all together. So it was a lot of trial and error and spreading papers all over the downstairs floor and putting them in little stacks and then like reading through and deciding, does this work? I ended up basically, it's in 4 sections, and I was really thinking about the 4 seasons and basically the cycle of the year, the wheel of the year, and this idea of the cyclical nature of time or the spiralic nature of time was really something that I've been engaging in a lot. Like things change, but they don't always, like things come back to where they were, but they're not the same, right? There's there's a change, there's a difference, there's a development. And so I've just been playing with that idea in my whole life. And it seemed like a really interesting way to organize the book. And so that's why there's like a solstice and there are 2 solstice and equinox poems, because I was thinking about it as a cycle of the year. And then for a while, I really wanted each section to have a strong elemental association. So fire, water, earth, and air. And I kind of let go of that with the various iterations after a while, but there is still a little bit of that in each section.
I'm so struck by 10 years of writing poems, because I think sometimes as creators, at least this is true for me, I think I have a real short-term kind of intensity. And I love the spaciousness of, like, I was doing a really intense job. So this other really important part of me it was still there, but it couldn't be on the front burner. And then what was it like to look at 10 years of work with an eye? Was it, I mean, were you blown away by what you created? At times were you like, how did I write that?
Yeah.
All of the above and more.
I definitely had this experience of like, did I really write that? Like, what is this? Where did it come from? Like not really having a memory of writing it.
I love that. It's also very odd. It's very like, who wrote that?
Yeah. But it gave me an ability to really play with the poems because I wasn't tied to them as they were. I didn't feel like, oh, this is like the perfect, precious version of this poem.
Of course, because you had so much distance from it. It can become something else if it needs to.
Yeah. And so a lot of poems actually in here are like, I took a stanza from this poem and I took a stanza from a poem I wrote like 5 years after that. Yeah. And like, I'm like, oh, they're speaking to each other across this distance of years. And they actually belong together in the same poem. And so, yeah, that was a really interesting process.
That makes my imagination tickle, because it doesn't even have to be your poetry. Like if someone took different bodies of work and let it talk to each other in new ways. We had a guest on who talked about idea sex and doing this with different, different authors, and having them, talk to each other and figuratively have sex. But you could also do it with you could do it with your essay in a poem. You could do it with a piece of film that you made, it's very exciting to me. I'm gonna have to go away and think about that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love like collaging and just like I love what you said, that it could be like with a film or like the multimedia version of it. I love that.
You've done a really different kind of book launch with the poetry collection Last Days. Can you take us through how that idea got started and then how it was executed? Because it didn't look easy.
Yes.
It's amazing. It's really gotten, once again, my imagination going about how to do future book launches or help people with book launches. But yeah, so can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And just to say, I'm in the middle of it still. So it's not done, but
it's unfolding.
It's unfolding, exactly. Yeah. Which is also, well, I'll talk about it as I get there, but it is also like rethinking, like a book launch has to be, the day or the week that your book launches.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Because it's that whole, you got to get on a list, you got to get the bookstore's attention.
Right.
But that model, first of all, we don't have to subscribe to it. And second of all, it is not nearly as monolithic as that. I mean, the book business has changed so much. And just like you said earlier in the interview, why can't we envision something different?
Exactly.
I'm interrupting.
No, I mean, that's exactly my thoughts on that. So yeah, how did it happen? Well, I knew that I wanted to do something different. And I was thinking, I would go on tour, this pre-pandemic, I would go on tour and maybe connect with different social justice organizations in the cities that I was going to and invite them to the, bookstore reading or maybe like have a fundraising party for a couple of them in those different cities, because I knew I wanted to speak to organizers and activists because that's who I wrote this book for. And then the pandemic happened. The first couple months of the pandemic, I was just like not thinking about the book launch at all, thinking about like, how do you get groceries in the house safely? And,
and
all
do we
of those
need to
things.
wipe everything down or do we not need to wipe everything down? And can you go for a walk with someone or not?
Exactly.
Remember when we were even like, do you wear masks? Like before?
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed like ancient history. It was just over a year ago.
I know. So when I kind of like realized that the pandemic wasn't going to end anytime in the foreseeable future, and I had this book launch coming up, I just tried to think about it and got super overwhelmed by the uncertainty of it, by the feeling like this was like sometime in the summer, and I felt like I had wanted like a year to plan my book launch, and I had, I was already like behind. I wasn't really behind, but I felt like I was behind. And so there was just a lot of anxiety and unhappiness in our household around this.
Oh my gosh. I was going through the same thing launching a book, and I got so frozen and so anxious and so depressed for the first time I hadn't been depressed in years. I would leave my little office here and go across my deck to my bed and just crawl in my bed in the middle of the day, and it was weird. It was really hard.
I feel like the pandemic kind of made everything really intense, so it makes sense that we're launching a book
hard enough.
Right, exactly. And it's like vulnerable, you're like putting yourself out there. So my partner, who is amazing, Patty Lynn, she's like my love, and she's also like my co-conspirator and like real partner, creative partner. And she's an organizer of people, not closets. So she was like talking me through my anxiety, and she was like, well, who do you want to know about this book? And I said, organizers, activists, healers, cultural workers, like people doing the work to change this world. And so she was like, well, why don't you just give them the books? And I was like, how would I do that? Well, in addition to being an organizer, she's also an amazing fundraiser. So she's like, we'll just raise the money to make it happen. And I was like, okay. And I also I know how to fundraise. I think fundraising is like a really central part to social change, to like talk to people about money and ask them to put their money where their values are. So we came up with this plan. I made a whole budget. So I was like, okay, I think I want to give away like 250 copies of this book. That feels like doable. And then I also want to do this big event with speakers from organizations, and bringing artists and organizers together, and do a teaching guide. So I made that whole plan. I made the whole schedule, which was like supposed to end in April. Now it's like ending in September, I think, but made it much more spacious as we went. But yeah, then I just started asking my networks, my family, my family's friends, my friends to fund the project. And I raised $15,000 altogether. Yeah. And so now we are, and as I was doing that, I was thinking, this is great to do for me, but like if I'm putting all of this energy in it, I also want to be supporting and uplifting other writers of color. So how do I do that?
I love that part of it. I love that generosity. I mean, the whole thing is clearly generous, but that was like, I'm not just going to pick myself up. I'm going to pick other people up too.
Right. I feel like that's like also part of like rethinking how we do things. Like I'm not interested in competing or the scarcity mindset.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's how I feel about this podcast. It's like, who can I find that I want to lift up to help the people who are listening create out loud, but also so people find your work.
Right. Yeah. I think that's actually like a very artistic impulse. In Eulabis's Having and Being Had, she talks about how she first, and maybe the only time, experienced the gift economy was with other poets. And I do think that's just like poets and artists, like we make things and we want to give them away. Like imposing the market on it, I think is really, it's not, I don't want to say natural, because what is natural, but I don't think it's like the artistic impulse isn't to like make something to sell it. It is really to make things to share and to share with other people, and to uplift other people, like you were saying. So
yeah, it's one of the things I'm fascinated about. I'm thinking about different ways that my work might go in these next years. And one of the things that happens a lot when I work with creators and writers more intimately is that getting the word out and making money and surviving or thriving. But then that same impulse, whether it's it's the fear of vulnerability and being seen and not being good enough, gets mixed in with, I don't want to be part of the marketplace, but also gets mixed in with, but I don't want to do that job anymore. I just want to do my art.
Right.
It's complicated. It's hard to tease out in ways. I don't know that any of us ever tease it out perfectly. And I think that's really important too. Like Michelangelo didn't tease it out perfectly. He hated the popes. He had to kiss their asses.
Right. Right. I mean, we still live in a capitalist society and we still have to pay the bills and we have to figure that part out. But
I want our work to be shared.
Yeah. And so I think for me, I was just thinking about like, how do I navigate capitalism in a way that feels like most aligned with my values and how I want to do this book launch. And so
I love that. I just even think about that because again, this is the theme of the conversation for me. It's that wonder and play and magic to step out of the mold of it has to be this way and just question it. And your partner played such a wonderful role in that.
I found Gabrielle Savelle, who is a Black performance artist and writer. And I had seen her perform a while ago and just really loved her stuff. And she had a chapbook that was coming out around the same time, although the pandemic has delayed its printing. So it's going to come out at the end of this month. But she was super excited about the project. So I raised enough money to buy 250 copies of my book and her chapbook, and we're sending it out to folks. And yeah, we just put out a call. I asked a few of like 5 people in my life who are poets and organizers and artists to be like an advisory council to me. I called them the Catalyst Circle, and they helped me come up with the plan, and they helped me do outreach to organizations who might be interested in this. So we just kind of spread the word really widely, and the people just started signing up to get the book, to get both books. And it was really just kind of exciting to see every day I would check the, Google Form spreadsheet and be like, oh, this person from Black Lives Matter is signing up. This person from a reproductive justice organization is signing up, all from all over the country, even like places like the UK and the Czech Republic. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to get the books to them, but we'll figure it out. So yeah, it was just like so thrilling to see that people were really, I didn't know if people would sign up. I didn't know if this would seem like such a wild idea that nobody would do it, but it got really people excited. And I think this idea of like, you don't have to have a book launch. That's the traditional book launch. You can figure out like who your audience is and how to get your work to them has really been resonating with other poets that I've talked to and other writers who are rethinking like how are they going to do it. And that was kind of my hope too, is like I would love to, you know, just keep talking about this and share like my lessons learned, and you know, so that other people can make their own version of it. That feels right, more right to them than maybe what we all have been told what we need to do when we launch a book.
So speaking of lessons learned, anything that you would do differently?
I did just try and pack everything into the like everything has to be done by the time my book launched, and that just like caused a lot of stress and like undue stress. Unneeded. Yeah. So then I did have this understanding like I couldn't make my whole year a book launch year, you know, so I like made it much more spacious. So I definitely think giving yourself the space to do what you need to and want to do in a timeline that's, you know, like you're going to get it done in a way that feels right and healthy to you. That was definitely a main lesson. And I think the other lesson is just I had to like figure out how to talk about this project because it is so outside of what many people think about. So I had to like articulate and re-articulate the project to reach different audiences.
Yeah, so important.
Yeah.
And so hard because, I mean, you do write in your job. So you do have a lot of skills around that articulation, but it's usually the hardest thing to do for our own work.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's about, yeah. And you should sign up to get a copy because you'll really like it.
Right. I asked a friend of my parents and she like to donate, and she donated, and she's like, I don't really understand this, but I trust you. And I was like, well, that's so kind and generous of you, but that means I need to like figure out how to articulate it better.
It more clear. Yeah. And we have so little time with people's attention span now, you know, 10 seconds or so before they'll get confused and go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, really fascinating. So I'm going to switch topics for a second. I want to ask about a wonderful essay, again, on your Substack newsletter about growing up speaking both English and Japanese. You wrote, as a result, I internalized two very different worldviews, approaches, and spiritualities in my language and in my body and in my thoughts. Somehow I was able to move through my childhood holding the worldview that the individual was most important and also that the collective was most important, that everything and everyone was connected, and also that we're all islands unto ourselves, that things could and should be separated and categorized into white and black, alive and not alive, and also that nothing can be separated, that things are animated with spirit, that there is a whole rainbow of color between black and white. So can you take us into how you perceive and work with language as a writer because of this? It seems to me in the poems in Last Days that that's very present, even in the two poems you read for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think that I became a poet because of this, because of how I understood that the world is not just one thing, that it's much bigger than how like a single language would frame it as.
And the way we categorize things based on culture, based on language.
Yeah. And I feel like poetry is a way that really, as close as possible in my own personal experience, to being able to hold all of the complexities and contradictions and mysteries of the world, because it uses language, but often in a very non-linear way, often in a way that really relies on leaps of imagination and associations, associations, not necessarily even based on meaning, but maybe based on sound or the texture of the word in your mouth, And so for me, when I enter into poetry, it's a whole different way of reading. I'm not reading for meaning and to get a logical argument out of it. I'm reading to enter into the world of the poem. And that's kind of how I hope to create poems that do that for the reader. And I think there is something magical about poetry. I'm actually working on a new book with two other poets called Poetry as Spellcasting, or it's about poetry spellcasting. I don't know what the title will end up being.
I love that.
But yeah, it really is like, it is casting a kind of spell out into the world. And I think I arrived at that way of understanding poetry from growing up with two different languages and worldviews kind of really in my head and in my body and in my heart, I think that's the story I tell anyway.
Right. We're always
how I became a poet.
We're just making up our stories about whatever happened, right? And luckily we get to do it as part of our work. So
exactly.
What feeds your creative life?
I think first and foremost, nature, being out in the natural world, being part of the rhythms of the seasons, the ocean. I live in the Boston area, so I get to go to visit the Atlantic Ocean pretty often. And it's such a force, it's such a powerful force. And it's so vast. And every time I come back from the ocean, I feel renewed. And like my well of creativity has been filled up. And I think as part of that and beyond that, like just being in my body, when I'm very present in my body and able to like really take in the whole world with all of my senses, and not just like live in my brain up here and walk around as if I didn't have a body, but when I'm really able to experience the world through the sensation and the sensory pleasures of the world, that feeds my creativity the best. And then I think also being in relationship with other people, other writers, other artists of color, and activists and organized people who are really, who share with me, who I like learn from, and get to be in conversation about like, how do we create change in this world that desperately needs change. And queer folk, those of us who have, been marginalized and excluded. I think there's like our communities really, like, we take care of each other and we nourish each other and we feed each other as like resistance, and it's also like such a generative space in that resistance and creation of new worlds.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. And I think, we all have to have our communities, whatever they are. Mm-hmm. So I love to ask this question last. What will you learn next?
I love that question.
Me too.
I feel like I'm always learning. So I love to think about this. And I think very practically, I've been learning to grow food. Even before the pandemic started, I didn't actually decide, I definitely got the message from Spirit that I needed to learn how to grow food. So I am learning how to plant seeds and nourish them and help them grow into beautiful plants that feed us. And like how to make compost and how to make herbal remedies. Like those are the very practical things that I feel like I'm such a beginner at. But beyond that, I hope that I learn really how to continue to paint the vision of the world, the kind of world that we deserve, that all of us deserve, which is not the world we live in right now, and how to do that better in community, and how to do that in a way that brings more and more people in. And I can't say exactly what those skills will be that will help me do that, but that is, that's what I'm always kind of leaning into and working toward. That doesn't exactly answer your question.
Oh, no, totally. It has an intention and a focus. And I think that's the first thing the first thing and the constant thing we have to do when we're asking ourselves, what do we want to learn? Mm-hmm. It has to be connected, like you said earlier, to our values, to the vision we have for our lives and for the life of the world that we want to live in. Mm-hmm. And then we have to keep checking in with it, because it's super easy in this world to get I'll learn that. Oh, wait, don't learn that.
Yeah.
So I love that as a beautiful focus to it. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your presence and your poetry. It was absolutely delightful.
Thank you, Jen. This was really a fun conversation. I really appreciate your inviting me to be in conversation with you and to be part of this podcast. I'm so grateful.
Thank you. Me too.